from here, that is the limit of my body. I try to learn. I last few weeks, I building program Duolingo, which has told me stay where it's at. That right height. I'm also aware that I born in England, not England, with a strong accent. Maybe I spoke to translators earlier. They say I try to speak slowly. When I get enthusiastic about a situation, I get practice. Rather than completely incomprehensible. Say it's a genuine pleasure to be here. A real honor. Yeah. So I should thank the whole staff. Also, I can't being here. I should also say that in the entire history of the Irish state, and there's been one 100 million Irish state, stand from so many even options with fighting. It also thank you for arranging weather so the lack of Ireland. So far it is grey and it has rained a lot since I arrived. Very good of you. So I was asked to talk today about the challenges of naval power in the light of crises. And when I chose the slide, I chose it deliberately for a couple of reasons. And then what it sticks is an exercise subject in 2021 in Japanese, British, and the American Navy, Asia. And the reason I chose the slide tonight is it displays something about naval power today, that it is frequently collaborative. Usually navies operate with other navies or with other agents. Of course, there's a reason really careful set by the context of going on. But it occurred to me when I talked about attempted war strike that we have no idea about that. We have to ask which war and which price. What do we look for? Because what you see depends on where you stand, and the perspective from either Britain will not be very different. From a European, the major consensus challenges are associated with the apparent threat posed by Russia, particularly in 2022, and that has transformed even Ireland substantial the image on the bottom left is a Russian television program. If you send a threat to Britain of a nuclear explosion in the Atlantic, sending a radioactive wave over the United Kingdom, it's called shocking Ireland. What the Russians ignore that wave is either further. In any case, and also the recent war in Gaza. From an American perspective, those things are not important. But of course, the Americans have the re-emergence of and from the American perspective, there's some commonality, but also some differences. American. And of course, if you were from East Asia itself, you would be concerned about the naval rivalry with the United States and China. You would be concerned about direct China. And what's interesting here is that major challenge might more often be challenge is non-traditional operating control radar. But it's worth remembering that the individual nations they also have challenges amongst themselves. So we need to have bottom left to take the newspaper report, black, Indonesian postcard efforts, and Vietnamese efforts over the countries. But it's a complex mixed situation challenge that they can have also and the bigger of they have around the world, different people see things differently. So at the same time as we have traditional naval challenges, we have more recent non-traditional challenges associated with climate change or with drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, legal and regulated fishing. In Europe, there's a major concern about human trafficking across the Mediterranean Sea, which has brought death and misery to many tens of thousands. So these all call for a different type of response than traditional naval versus naval confrontation. They generally require collaboration between navies of different nations. They require collaboration between navies and other agencies, and fit to what my old boss, Jeffrey Till, calls postmodern approach to naval activity, which is a long-winded way of saying a whole lot of different crises out there and a really complex world in which we live. It's kind of reflected in much Western military doctrine. The image there is taken from British defence doctrine, contemporary British defence doctrine, and it aims to make the point that we used to think of war and peace as separate entities, as black and white, as different things, and that isn't a useful way to think about crises and challenges today. That actually what we have are a sliding scale, a mix of things. Sometimes we will be cooperating with other nations. Sometimes we will be in competition with them. And in terms of what navies must do, it is to have that capacity to operate to the left and the right of that scale. Very frequently we'll be cooperating to meet common threats like piracy or drug trafficking. Sometimes we will be forced to take a competitive focus. And what events, from a European perspective, what events in Ukraine in 2022 did was to remind people that the good guys don't get to choose. The good guys don't get to choose when you are at the competitive end of that scale. It is our enemies and our adversaries that choose when we fight. You can be as peaceful as you like, but if your adversaries do not want peace, you need to be able to operate to the right of that scale. And for a period in the early 2000s, particularly in Europe, we forgot that. We assumed that those days had gone, that we were living in a period not of perpetual peace, but a period where open conflict between states was hard to contemplate. Those days are gone. That is reflected certainly in European thinking about defense. So it's all complex. The next question is, what do we mean by naval policy? And that should, I think, give me an opportunity to do what I always do when I'm asked to lecture, which is I'm an historian. I look backwards before I look forward. And in terms of understanding where naval policy sits, a good starting place, I think, is the work of Julian Corbett. And he's a naval historian who died over a century ago. He wrote some very perceptive things. And I agree with what the Admiral said in his initial speech. Much changes, but some principles remain. And this one's quite an obvious one if you think about it. What Corbett emphasized in his work is naval policy is a subset of wider things. You cannot understand what navies do unless you think in a broader maritime context. You must think about all the elements of national power that can operate at and from the sea. The navies fit in that wider context. And the maritime context, maritime strategy and policy, only makes sense if understood in the context of national policy. So naval policy is a subset of the wider things your nation is trying to achieve. And for that reason, it must always be different. Ireland will have a different naval policy than Sri Lanka because we have a different national policy. Brazil will have a different naval policy than Argentina or Chile or Italy or India because you have a different set of national policies. So there is no single way forward. It's also important to remember, though, that it doesn't just cascade down from the top. Government setting priorities that navies must follow. It also feeds back up the line. There are some things navies cannot do. National policy must reflect that. There are some enduring challenges at sea that you cannot ignore without dire consequences. and national policy must reflect that. So it feeds back up towards national policy as well as down. This has all been explained very well in Geoffrey Till's great book on sea power, where he presents an updated version of exactly what Julian Corbett was talking about. If you set national priorities, national aims, and national values, and naval policy must be reflective of that. What does this all mean in practice? Well, in some jobs, you can take a template. If you're a carpenter or a builder, there are templates you can use to cut out a pattern that will always work. The corner of a building can always be the same. That does not apply to naval policy. Naval policy is different. There are no templates. It must be tailored to suit the specific context of the environment. Having said that, some things do remain constant. Navies might differ in time and place. The seas are the same. The maritime environment sets constraints and opportunities that are common to all. So that does bring a certain dynamic, certain discipline to whatever it is we try to do at sea. But while the physical space of the sea doesn't change, well, it changes a little. The recession of Arctic ice is changing the dynamics of northern security in terms of opening up sea routes that change the way we will think about operating in those waters. But the physical space doesn't tend to change very much. The legal and political factors that determine how we use that space are very subject to change. They can and they do change. They changed when the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was introduced. They may change again if nations such as China succeed in their ability to change the norms and practices of international politics and international law. And the point is explored very well in the book you see on screen, Power in the Maritime Domain, produced by Professor Moreira, which explains and articulates precisely that the context in which navies operate is not fixed and immutable. It may change over time. And being a naval historian, of course, I keep looking backwards, and it's very hard for somebody in my position to even begin to discuss naval power unless you mention Alfred Mahan. And I'm guessing you've all been through the Naval Academy at some stage, so you've met this guy before. I'm probably sick of hearing about him, so I won't talk about it. I'm nodding heads now, so I won't talk about Mahan for too long. Of course, Mahan was a US naval officer. He gained fame from writing a series of books from 1890 until the First World War, which explored the nature of maritime power and strategy. And he perhaps did more than anybody to advance the idea of sea power as a decisive influence in terms of international relations. So famously, he wrote this point: the control of the sea by maritime commerce and naval supremacy means predominant influence in the world. The reason I mention Mahan is he did kind of suggest that there was a template. There was a right and a wrong way of doing naval power. And for Mahan, the ability to command events at sea was a decisive factor. The point being taken up by the US Navy and repeated very often over the past century or so. So in the 1950s, the American admiral and strategist James Wiley picked up that Mahanian idea about the dominance of sea power and talked about potential control. The potential to exert control in the maritime space can have decisive influence in world affairs, because if you are so strong that people will not face you, that gives you great leverage in crises. They will back down rather than challenge you. More recently, the point has been made, same point being made by the American commentator Robert Rubel, who talks about command of the sea as denoting a strength relationship between or among contending navies in which the difference is such that weaker navies dare not challenge the stronger. The ideal state for naval power is to be so strong that your enemies just don't even bother trying, because you are too powerful for them. This sounds like a nice position to be in. And of course, it has happened in the past. There have been occasions when navies have been that strong. The British Navy in the 19th century had that degree of command. They were a dominating naval force, and it was simply pointless for anybody to challenge the British at sea because they failed. And the French did, on rare occasions, seek to create an arms race against the British and were decisively defeated. The British Navy just outbuilt, built bigger and better ships in greater numbers. Reflected, for example, here in the review at Spithead in 1887. That collection of ships that the Royal Navy gathered together to celebrate the Jubilee of Queen Victoria would have defeated the combination of any two or maybe three great powers together. There was no point challenging them. More recently, the position the United States Navy was in after 1945 commonly fits that model. A navy of such dominating power, just not worth the effort. That, of course, is not where we're at today. We are not in a position where the United States Navy has guaranteed potential control of the world's oceans, because the emergence of a peer rival, absent since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has completely changed the way in which the United States is thinking about future challenges at sea. And it's worth noting that, of course, this happened. The British themselves were dominant in the 1880s, and 20 years later had to face a very serious challenge by a potential peer rival. This is normal within international relations. And in terms of thinking about how do you respond to that, what do you do when this happens, Mahan and his fellow travelers have very clear ideas. Reflected here in this concept of you seek command of the sea. You seek command of the sea by hunting and defeating your enemy. So in this case, we have two quotations, one by a British admiral and one by a German admiral, that make the point that the primary aim of naval warfare is to gain command. These days, at the tactical and the operation level, we would not talk, I think, about command of the sea. We would talk about sea control as a more realistic, slightly more limited concept. But that idea of sea control as the overriding priority of naval warfare remains deeply embedded in certainly the Western approaches, and also, I think, in what the Chinese and the Russians do. So the definition of naval warfare taken from current American doctrine is common across most navies. I'm sure it will be the same for Brazil. Sea control is a condition in which one has the freedom of action to use the sea for one's own purposes in specified areas and for specified periods of time, and where necessary, to deny use to the enemy. It is limited in time, space, and degree. The sea is a big place. It covers 2/3 of the planet. You cannot control it all of the time, and you don't need to. Sea control gets relevant for what it enables you to do. So it's an enabler for something else. It's not an end in itself. The question of how you gain sea control is also an interesting one to come to shortly. Maybe it's because I'm getting old now that I keep looking backwards to previous texts to sort of explain things in terms of contemporary problems. And I quite like the article here by the American Admiral Francis Turner, published in the 1970s, as an explanation of how control operates in practice. And what Turner did well in his article was the point that control and denial are elements of the same thing. Sometimes you're emphasizing denial, sometimes you're emphasizing control. In some spaces, your focus will be on control. In some spaces, your focus will be on denial. The navies will move up and down that scale depending on time and place. And one of the things that Turner strongly emphasized in his piece, way back in the 1970s, at the beginnings of the naval missile age, was that denial is easier. It is easier to mess with people at sea than it is to do anything positive. Denial can be a form of guerrilla warfare at sea. So if you want to get positive use of the sea, that's challenging. That is difficult. So how do you get sea control? From a traditional perspective of Alfred Mahan and of the US Navy since Mahanian times, the focus has been on combat, and particularly on this idea of a decisive naval engagement. The best way to do naval power, if you follow the Mahanian vision, is to concentrate your forces offensively and aggressively seek out the enemy and destroy them. And once they have been defeated, that gives you control of the seas, and you can use that for all the different things that you want to do. It is a very seductive idea. It's very popular amongst naval officers, and it's popular amongst naval historians like myself, because we love writing about big, exciting battles. And of course, you can look through history and find lots of examples of apparently decisive battles, whether it's at Lepanto in the Mediterranean in 1571, or the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, or the Battle of Flushing later in 1905. These were important events that did change the nature of those wars. Or more recently, the Battle of Midway in the Second World War, or even the sinking of the Argentinian cruiser General Belgrano in 1982. Just one ship, but the British capacity to sink that ship changed the nature of the naval war by forcing the Argentinian surface fleet back home because they could not deal with the threat by the British submarine. There's a book, though. It's dangerous to think of these things as single events. The Battle of Trafalgar is perhaps the most startling naval victory in the history of the Royal Navy, but it was only one of 3 battles that occurred in the Trafalgar campaign. And the Trafalgar campaign began in March 1805 and finished in November. It was a long campaign. It was not one event in one day. It was a series of events. The Battle of Midway is a turning point in the Pacific War, but it is not the only battle. There were battles that came before, and there were battles that came after, and the war lasted 3 more years. So we should not think of these battles as individual single events. They're part of a process. There's also a question of what makes a battle decisive. Is a battle decisive because there were lots of ships, or lots of ships sunk, or is something else the thing that matters? And here is an example: the Battle of Lissa in the war between Italy and Austria in 1866. That's a big battle. The Austrians had a fleet of 26 ships. The Italians had a fleet of 32 ships. They engaged in the Adriatic off the island of Lissa, and 2 Italian ships were sunk, giving Austria victory. Is that a decisive battle? No. It doesn't change anything very serious about the war. Austria still lose the war. The war is decided on land, where Prussian, German armies defeat the Austrians. This battle is it's not insignificant. It's not decisive. It isn't hugely important. Whereas the Battle of Angamoth in the War of the Pacific is, I think, a decisive battle. And I don't know if we have any Chilean naval officers. We have a Chilean naval officer. So I think the Chilean victory here is an example of a decisive battle. And this is small. You have a battle that revolves essentially around 2 Chilean armored frigates and 1 Peruvian armored monitor and other smaller ships. And after an extended engagement, the Peruvian monitor is defeated and captured. And this is small stuff, one ship. But that is the only armored ship the Peruvian armed forces have. That gives Chile control of the seas off the Pacific coast of South America. And that is a fundamental key factor in the success of Chile in that war, because it allows Chile to transport troops up and down the coastline of Latin America. It allows them to move supplies, and it allows them to blockade their enemy. So the size of the battle doesn't matter. It's what it allows you to do. So in this sense, I think Chile provided an excellent example of the size of battle. Size doesn't matter. It's what you do with it. And we could use similar examples from the history of the Brazilian Navy. And here I have a problem, because I know almost nothing about the history of the Brazilian Navy, except what I read in actually the book by Professor Moreira. But I think the example taken here of naval engagement in the war against Paraguay again fit that model of actually decisive engagement. This is not fleet versus fleet encounters on the high seas, but the ability to use that maritime space is a key factor in eventual Brazilian success in that war. And it doesn't matter if that's on the high seas or in the littoral or in a riverine environment. A decisive battle is a battle that changes the conditions of a conflict to allow you to achieve whatever the national aims are. So I would cite this as a decisive battle. I think actually it's significant that I'm a naval historian. I spent my entire life reading about naval history and naval battles. And it was only in the last few weeks that I even became aware of this, because naval historians from a European, English-speaking perspective are lazy. We look at the Royal Navy and we look at the American Navy as if the 2 dominant navies are all we need to think about. And the point worth remembering is that maybe in the period between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, the Royal Navy fight no decisive battles at sea, because nobody challenges them, whereas the navies of Chile and Brazil do. So we need to look beyond just the big navy. Of course, the biggest navy at the moment is, well, not the biggest, but the most powerful navy is still the United States Navy. They remain quite wedded to this concept of decisive battle. If you look at current American naval doctrine, they strongly emphasize this point, saying that naval battles have occurred much less frequently than land battles, which is true, but they're more likely to generate major strategic results, as evidenced by the battles of Virginia Capes, Trafalgar, and Midway. They go on to make this claim that the British Army surrendered at Yorktown in the American War of Independence, but the battle was won at Virginia Capes. A naval battle delivers American independence, not a land battle. think that's a statement the American Army might have trouble with, but the American Navy are advancing that idea. In fact, remarkably for the Americans, what they're actually saying is the French Navy won the War of Independence for them. They make this point. A nation's navy and its strategic aspirations can succeed or be destroyed in a single battle. A single naval engagement can be decisive in the context of a particular war, which is an interesting idea. And they advance from that and suggest that what this means is that the levels of war are contract in naval warfare. They're pushed together. Events of tactical importance can have immediate strategic impact. Because if you are decisively defeated at sea, an army that is decisively defeated can retreat, reform, and fight again. A navy that is decisively defeated cannot be replaced within years. So it contracts those levels of war. And the example that they use is the one that's already been mentioned, the American victory in the War of Independence at Yorktown. And of course, what I want to do is to give you now a history of the War of American Independence. I'm a historian, and that's what we like to do. We'll be here all day, and you will all fall asleep, so I won't do that. But just to cover the key points, what are the Americans saying? Context here is the last major British army in North America was besieged by superior American and French forces and a coastal position at Yorktown. And the British Navy, based in New York, sorted to relieve that besieged force. And a fleet under Admiral Graves with 19 British warships sailed down to Yorktown and was met by a larger French fleet of 24 warships. And in a 2-hour engagement that followed, the British failed to defeat the French. It was an inconclusive engagement, and the British fleet disengaged. In the entire battle, only one ship was sunk. The British ship was badly damaged and was later scuttled. What this was, the British could not support their besieged army, and Yorktown eventually surrendered, which is why the US Navy claimed this naval battle as a decisive engagement. But I think this is problematic, isn't it? You can't just extract this one naval battle from the wider context of everything else. Surely the American army on land had something to do with this victory. And surely the sequence of events that led to this battle and the sequence of events that followed this battle are important. It's worth knowing that the British Navy came back. Admiral Graves came back to rescue that British army who just arrived 2 days late. If he'd been a more energetic admiral and sailed 3 days earlier, maybe everything would have changed. My point is, it's dangerous to put too much weight on the idea that a single event contained everything. And also dangerous to believe doctrine writers when they use their history. This is very shaky history. If a student had submitted this in an essay to me, he would have got a paperback covered in red ink. So concept is more complex than has been presented here. And as a British naval historian, it's important for me to emphasize that the French might have won at Chesapeake Bay, but they were soundly defeated at the next battle, and that gives my national pride some sort of sound. The victory at Chesapeake Bay, the victor at Chesapeake Bay, Admiral de Grasse, spent the rest of the war in British prison, so normal service was regime. What does this all mean today? Well, of course, you all know what we've seen in recent years is the re-emergence of a peer rival. The American Navy, dominant on the world's ocean since the end of the Cold War, now faces a rival that can credibly challenge it in some places. It is the most widely discussed issue globally in terms of maritime strategy and has impacts that cascade downwards. The American refocus on the Pacific has impacts to Europe, because Europe now must face a future where the Americans are more focused on something else. And eventually, I think it will have a significant impact on every ocean as Chinese ships begin to appear with more regularity in seas where they were once absent. That will then draw in American ships, and I suspect eventually there will be nowhere in the world that is not touched to some degree by that Sino-American rivalry. And a particular challenge associated with the growth of Chinese naval power is that China is not a satisfied state. In Europe, most countries to the center and the west of Europe are quite happy with their position in the world. The Chinese, that is not so. They are dissatisfied with a number of the ways in which international norms, practices, and legal procedures are interpreted, and they wish to see those changed. They are dissatisfied with the territorial position. They fervently believe that Taiwan is Chinese. They believe that Senkaku Islands are Chinese. They believe that the islands in the South China Seas are Chinese. And they are advancing those causes in an aggressive manner, with implications for all of the Navy. So China accommodating the growth of Chinese power may be a difficult thing. And the Chinese Navy is now the biggest Navy in the world. And those figures are taken the slide that may now even be slightly out of date. Chinese Navy has grown from very, very humble beginnings to a force of very extraordinary power in 20 years. If we were having this lecture 20 years ago, we would not have been saying too much about the Chinese Navy. It's grown very quickly and very powerful. It is not the most powerful Navy in the world. It is not as well equipped as the American Navy. It does not appear yet to be as well trained. It does not have the same experience in complex operations at long range, but it is a very powerful naval force, perhaps equivalent to the French Navy of the 18th century or the German Navy of the early 20th. Not the most powerful, still a force that cannot be ignored. And while the Chinese Navy might be outmatched by the Americans and the American allies on the world's oceans, in waters close to China, I would be reluctant to send any ships in a conflict situation because, of course, the Chinese Navy is backed up by a vast array of land-based systems, including aircraft, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, ballistic missiles, electronic warfare capabilities, cyber capabilities, space-based reconnaissance, and so on and so forth. And in waters where the Chinese maritime forces can be supported by these joint elements, they will be a fearsome adversary. This is not unprecedented. This is actually the norm in naval warfare. And a lot of the current, which we've talked about, this is a huge problem. Oh my goodness, what can the American Navy do facing this unprecedented challenge? It is normal for the dominant Navy to be challenged. Periods of complete command, as Robert Rubel talked about, are rare historically. The Royal Navy had it in the 19th century, but for most of the history of the Royal Navy, its control was contested. It had to fight to be where it needed to be, and there were some places it could not go. So we've returned to the historical norm. The anomaly was the period of American dominance. The range at which Chinese forces can pose a threat to the Americans, of course, will change, depend on a whole variety of things, including the evolution of technology. And I'm sure there are at least 100 people in this room better equipped to discuss that than I am. I'm largely a naval historian and naval professionals. But clearly, you can overstate the range. So this slide depicts the outer limits of what you can fire from China out to sea. And you can fire a DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile, maybe 4,000 kilometers from the Chinese coast. Well, you can fire a ballistic missile that distance. Whether it hits anything except NPC is another issue. Actually being able to target, strike a moving target at that range remains extraordinarily difficult. I suspect the range at which China can actually contest sea control could be measured in hundreds rather than thousands of miles now. But as new technology evolves, the ability of all actors to progress it, to project at greater range will impact things that need to do. That is inevitable. What I do know is that while you probably can't hit an aircraft carrier 4,000 miles away from a ballistic missile, you can certainly hit an airfield that doesn't move. The value of things that move is, I think, increased by the growing range, long-range strike capability. But we can talk about that later if you wish. The other thing of note, I think, is that the Chinese themselves recognize that it's no good protecting Chinese interests just in Chinese waters, because patterns of trade are global, not local. And we've seen in recent years that Chinese push to expand their range of naval interests and the so-called string of pearls, a series of Chinese funded ports and support facilities and the emergence of bases overseas, sees China reaching beyond local waters in a way that has alarmed the Americans, in a way that's not hugely dissimilar to what the new German Navy did in the 1900s, which also alarmed British commentators. So what we see here is not unprecedented. This creates a threat for some other navies. It also creates a Chinese vulnerability. Their capacity to support those positions in any conflict against a superpower would, I think, be as difficult as the Germans found against the British in 1914. What it also shows, though, is Chinese engagement in a global maritime trading system That gives them a stake in not going to war. And the idea that war between China and America is inevitable, I think, should be avoided. The Chinese wish to become wealthy and rich, as everybody else in the world does. They may prefer trade rather than conflict. They would certainly lose much if they did engage in open conflict with the United States. From an American perspective, what do you do when you face this threat? What's clearly reflected in American strategy and doctrine is they will take no steps backwards. Their response has been very bullish. They will maintain a forward deployed Navy capable of contesting sea control, even in waters close to the Chinese coastline. So the navigation plan of the previous chief of naval operations emphasized this point. The US Navy will build, maintain, train, and equip combat credible, dominant naval force. The Americans are not planning to share control of the seas with anybody. They are planning to find ways of maintaining dominance. How they will do that is an interesting question that, again, maybe we can discuss during the question period. There is an understanding that that will require new techniques. It's an understanding that that will require new technology. There's a recognition that operating within the weapons engagement zone of Chinese land-based capabilities will require the Navy to do different things. Only a fool will sail an American carrier battle group to Taiwan Straits in the teeth of a crisis that might go to war. But you might sail unmanned vessels, surface vessels. You might sail different types of naval vessels in those areas. And there's a growing recognition, strong recognition in America that the response is not naval. The response has to be maritime. It has to encompass all forces. So the US Marine Corps has undergone a profound change in its outlook of the things they expect to do in the years ahead. A difficult shift away from their previous focus on expeditionary operations towards something tailored to support the Navy in the fight to gain sea control. So Marine littoral regiments, small, mobile, lightly equipped units that can be deployed within that Chinese weapons engagement zone that can use land-based systems to help the Navy achieve sea denial and control. And it's really interesting that the latest edition of the US Army's Capstone Doctrine includes a chapter on operations in support of maritime forces. But even the US Army recognizes the key role that its land-based systems may play in support of the Navy. The American understanding is the Chinese response will be joint. The American response must be joint and multi-domain. And the current US Chief of Naval Operations, I think, has usefully articulated the requirement to think innovatively. He makes the point that to face the challenges of the future, we must innovate, we must think, we must come up with new ideas. So it remains to be seen what those new ideas are, but I think that's encouraging. The answers, I think, will not be found in the pages of the past. And I'm a naval historian, so I'm minded to think none of this is new. We have been here before. This is not the first time that a dominant navy has faced the emergence of a new peer rival. This is what the British faced 100 years ago. In the 1890s, in the early 1890s, the British Navy was dominant. And in the 1900s, they faced a major, powerful new navy. And their response seems different to what the US Navy is now doing. The British, as the Americans are focusing on the Pacific, the British focused on the North Sea, and they pulled their fleet back. So Britain in 1900 had a navy spread across the world's ocean, and in 1914, it was in the North Sea. And they left areas to other navies. The Western Hemisphere was left to the Americans. The Mediterranean was for the French. The Pacific was for the Japanese. The British faced Germany. In a way that is not entirely different from American ships will be pulled to East Asia, which will empty European seas of elements of American presence, which requires somebody else to step up. And the British approach in the First World War, and I'm not going to, I could lecture for hours, but I promise you I will not, just in a coverall sense, was the British abandoned the idea of battle as a key aim because they reckoned it was irrelevant to them. The British did not need to beat the German Navy. What they needed to do was stop the German Navy from doing anything. And there's only one place in the entire world the German Navy could beat the British, and that was in the seas just off the coast of Germany. that were filled with German minefields and submarines and torpedo craft. So the British quite sensibly decided, we won't fight the Germans on German terms. We don't need to beat them. We just need to stop them doing anything. So the British closed the English Channel using light forces and minefields. They based their fleet in the north, in Scotland, and any German fleet that tried to break out into the Atlantic would have to fight the British close to British bases on British terms in a position where they could not possibly win, which the Germans realized, so they never tried it. And the only place the Germans can win is a place the British will not fight. So the German Navy spent the first 2 years of the war rotting while the British Navy put their boot on the neck of Germany and started to starve their people. And that set the context for this naval engagement. There were places the Germans could call their own. The Baltic Sea was German. The British could not send ships into the Baltic. The southern North Sea was contested. Neither side could control that. And that meant there were things the British couldn't do. The British could not launch amphibious operations against the German coastline without fighting the Germans in a dangerous place. But what sort of army could the British have landed that would have defeated the larger, more powerful German land force it would face? It didn't cost them too much. Which means there were hardly any major naval engagements during the First World War. The two main fleets met once, Battle of Jutland in May 1916, where British signals intelligence gave them forewarning of a German sortie, and the German Navy met its ultimate nightmare of meeting the entire British fleet in battle. And the conduct of that battle is instructive in terms of thinking about to what extent did this matter. The Germans' only aim was to escape, and they ran away very effectively. And the British admiral did not pursue vigorously because he knew the battle didn't really matter that much. What he had to do was maintain control of the seas that mattered. So he operated with extreme caution. He allowed the Germans to escape because he did not want to risk his fleet. The German fleet escaped back to its home country, where it rotted as a strategic irrelevant until November 1918, when the fleet mutinied when it was asked to sail again, because they knew it was a suicide mission. What does this all mean? The British had a realistic approach to how you deal with a fear rival. You don't rush to fight them in the places they want you to fight them. What you do is you lock them up into a strategically irrelevant space and control 99% of the world's oceans. That means you win. In the long war, you win if you control that space. Rushing to aggressively carry the fight to an enemy if you don't need to fight is not sensible. If I was lecturing for the US Naval War College, I would advise them to study the Pacific Campaign less and the First World War more, because I think it gives you a better idea how to deal with a peer rival that is very dangerous in home waters, cannot challenge you further afield. But of course, China is not the only problem. And we have a naval war going on today as we speak. The Russian war against Ukraine has focused primarily around the land environment because they share a large land border. But naval forces have not been absent. We have seen the Russian Navy being used for missile strikes, gunfire support, for logistical support and small level transport, even some very minor amphibious landings, and a limited blockade of Ukrainian grain shipments. And we've seen Ukraine do exactly what you'd expect, is to fight back using whatever means are available asymmetrically. And things have not gone the way of the larger Navy. You will all have seen, I'm sure, the news reports and the various images online of successful Ukrainian attacks against apparently superior Russian forces using land-based missiles, air attacks, and even cheap drones. And a drone that costs a few tens of thousands can be used to destroy a warship that costs millions. And this is humiliating. Russia is used to being the dominant navy in the Black Sea, and it seems to be being beaten by a nation that has no navy. So what this means, the Russian Navy has pulled back most of its forces out of Crimea and cowers at the far end of the Black Sea. I think this tells us something about the competence of the Russian armed forces, but it also tells us something about the difficulty of exploiting command, the difficulty of gaining and exploiting sea control, even against an enemy with relatively limited resources. It's always been difficult. And right through into the current year, we're seeing a series of Russian ships being hit. And of course, the Russians are disadvantaged by they cannot reinforce Black Sea with the Montreux Convention. Yeah, stops them being able to move warships into that space in the context of an ongoing war. So it's an interesting conflict. I find it interesting as well, the Russian attempt to impose a blockade on Ukraine. Ukraine gains much of its foreign wealth through selling large amounts of grain. And Russia initially sought to block those ship movements, but it was constrained in its ability to do that, partly by Ukrainian forces, but mostly by politics. And this has always been the case, that politics impacts blockade as much as military force. Most of the countries receiving Ukrainian grain were countries that were diplomatically well disposed towards Russia. So a vigorous Russian blockade of Ukraine would hurt Russia's friends. So they were more amenable to agreeing to various diplomatic agreements that allowed Ukrainian grain shipments, as might normally be the case. And of course, when two countries engage in war, it's not just those two countries that are impacted. So the Russian blockade impacted grain shipments, which impacted the price of grain, which impacted a whole country in the developing world, because suddenly it became more expensive to try and feed their people. It also means that the Black Sea is filled with mines, some of which go adrift and float into the wrong spaces. And countries, including Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania, have formed an agreement to try and clear those mines, because mines don't care if they hit a Ukrainian ship or a Turkish ship or a Bulgarian ship, they hit what they hit. So if conflicts around the world draw in third parties, they impact more than just the belligerents. The impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been seismic in terms of European security. It has forced Europe to completely reevaluate its near neighbour. It has brought Finland and now more recently Sweden into NATO. So two avowedly neutral countries have been pulled into the NATO alliance. That changes the dynamic in the Baltic Sea. That makes Russia's position in the Baltic much weaker, but it also gives NATO a much more greater requirement to control the Baltic, because how else can you send support to Finland or the Baltic states in any crisis dealing with the Russians? It has re-energized a European focus on defense. Countries that had traditionally ignored the requirement to spend. The Germans had traditionally spent very little of their national wealth on defense, and that has overturned in the last 2 years. So I think Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a strategic blunder of gargantuan proportions. Even prior to 2022, NATO had reawakened the Russian challenge. So the Americans, having deactivated the Second Fleet in 2011, they reactivated it in 2018. Joint Force Command Norfolk was reactivated in 2018. NATO understands it is a maritime alliance tied together by that Atlantic river. So things have changed. And from a perspective I come from, I live and work in Ireland. It's a neutral country, and Ireland self-consciously tries to stand aside from NATO and the confrontation with Russia. But the Irish have become very aware that the Russians seem really very, very interested in things in Irish waters. So most of the transatlantic internet cables that connect Europe to the United States travel through the Irish exclusive economic zone. And there's been a lot of Russian naval activity in those waters. So there are now calls within the Irish context for the Irish Navy to gain a capability to at least monitor what's happening in the seas off the Irish coast. Lots of Russian fishing boats are appearing in those waters that don't appear to catch any fish. And when they're boarded by the Irish Naval Service, the crew are almost exclusively young men in their 20s with very short haircuts, don't seem to know very much about fishing. They're not fishing boats. It's not just within Ireland that that's caused an interest. Britain in particular has become very concerned about the vulnerability of subsea infrastructure to covert interference by Russian forces, and of investing in a range of new capabilities. Maybe the challenge is not nuclear-powered submarines and frigates and aircraft carriers. Maybe the threat is covert action on internet cables, gas connectors, and other things. And of course, as has always been the case, maybe the actual things that navies need to do are not fighting other navies, but dealing with the range of complex challenges that occur from time to time. So with ongoing conflict in Israel and in Gaza, between Hezbollah and between Hamas and the Israeli Defense Forces, has prompted instability in the Middle East. One of the reflections of that has been Houthi attacks on shipping heading through the Red Sea towards the Suez Canal, and a whole range of attacks on those ships, which has impacted on the patterns of maritime traffic. There has been a collapse in shipping heading through the Suez Canal and an increase in shipping going around the Cape, which means the ships take longer. It means the cargo is more expensive. And so that requires some form of naval response. And of course, we've seen the Americans leading in that with Operation Prosperity Guardian to protect shipping within that space, and American and British offensive strikes against Houthi forces using land-based and sea-based assets. And I think what's interesting here are the range of navies that were involved. It might really only be the British and the Americans launching the offensive strikes, but in terms of participating in the defensive mission to protect shipping, you have a wide range of nations involved. A great example of the ways in which navies can be used to send a diplomatic message. You want to show that you're standing with America, that you believe in the freedom of navigation of the seas. You deploy a staff officer to Operation Prosperity Guardian, and they get to put your flag on their website, and it makes a statement you stand with them. It doesn't require you necessarily even to deploy a ship. The European Union has also responded. They haven't launched offensive strikes against the Houthis, but they have deployed naval escorts to protect shipping through the Red Sea. And you have Italian and Greek and German, Netherlands ships all having engaged missiles and shot down weapons being fired at merchant ships in that area. It's a reflection of the European Union beginning to become a serious security actor in the maritime environment. And rather like the Chinese, the Europeans understand that you cannot protect the seas off your own coastline. There is no point dominating your own littoral if maritime traffic can't get there because it's been interdicted further afield. So the Europeans have warships deployed in the Red Sea, and they have areas of interest off the Gulf of Guinea and off the Arabian Peninsula as key points of maritime instability and key points in part of a globally interconnected whole. But it's not enough just to stay at home. We need to think of the oceans as a connected whole. And I forgot to put my watch in front of me, so I have no idea how long I've been looking at your faces. It's quite long enough. So I will try to form a few conclusions. And the first one is, of course, we are in an era of naval competition. The key point is that's normal. This is the historical norm. Periods of dominance by one power are the exception, and we should not be surprised different navies this laceration might act competitively. Navies will engage in competition, that is obvious, but they will also engage in cooperative activity. And the capacity to do both is important. Frankly, cooperation is the more usual thing. Countries do not spend most of their time fighting each other. They spend more time cooperating together to meet common threats. So the ability to do both is important. But I made the point at the start, and I'll make it again. We don't get to choose when conflicts happen. The bad guys choose. And if we are not able to meet that challenge, we give them greater incentive to be aggressive. They are less likely to be aggressive if they know we can respond if they are. As the Romans used to say, if you want peace, prepare for war. I think it's sensible. The sea is important. The sea remains the lifeblood of the international global economy. If ships stop moving on then all of our economies collapse and our societies descend into chaos. The sea is important, therefore sea control, of course, is important. Sea control is hard, as the Russians are discovering. It is easier to challenge than it is to control. It is, and it always has been, difficult. And it gets relevant to what you can do with it, which is kind of where I have a slight difficulty with the American description of their future plans. Global naval dominance, as if control was the aim. It's not the aim. It's a means to something else. Why do you need to control that particular space? And I use the example of the First World War. The British realized it would be lovely to control the Baltic, but they couldn't at reasonable cost. And they didn't need to, so they didn't try. Some seas you can't control. Find the ones that matter to you, ones that matter to your adversary, and think intelligently about what you can do, but also what you cannot do. Denial might most often be undertaken by non-naval capabilities. The Houthis are not using warships to try to deny access to the Red Sea. They're using drones and missiles and helicopter-based hijack attacks. They're using a range of asymmetric capabilities. The Ukrainians are not using frigates and destroyers to challenge the Russians. They're using drones and missiles and air attack special forces. Navies will be challenged in a multi-domain context, which means the response must be multi-domain. Naval power is only a subset of a wider maritime strategy that must include all forces and requires an interagency response. If you only think about people, I was about to say wearing blue uniforms, or wearing white uniforms. If you only think about people wearing naval uniforms, you're doing it wrong. You have to be able to work in a joint context. And there is nothing more difficult in a military environment than getting people from different agencies to work seamlessly together. It is one of the most challenging things, but it is a vital necessity. And that is one of the things the Americans are getting right with their focus on multi-domain operations. I wrote this presentation in the UK where to skin a cat is a common phrase, and then realized I have no idea if that translates well into Portuguese. I'm not suggesting that you should mutilate your pets. It's a phrase in Britain that means there's just more than one way of doing things. The dominant idea through naval history and strategy has been this one about concentrate your force, aggressively carry the battle to your enemy, impose victory on them. Sometimes that is the thing that is correct, but sometimes it is not. And to do naval policy well, we must think intelligently. And it must fit into the framework of national policy. What is it we are trying to achieve at the national level? What are the full range of capabilities that can be brought to bear at sea? What is it we want to do? The answers will not be in the pages of Mahan. The answers will require more serious thought and attention. That's just up there to show you there are worse things that can happen to you in a naval career than having to listen to me for about an hour. I think, however, questions carried at the end rather than now. So I look forward very much to your questions. I think that is always the most useful part of any presentation. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Será observado um intervalo de 20 minutos. Lembramos que para o período de debates, as perguntas poderão ser enviadas por meio de seus próprios aparelhos de celular, através dos QR Codes fixados nas paredes ou mediante o preenchimento das papeletas disponíveis na cabine localizada ao fundo do auditório. Para aqueles que desejarem obter o certificado, é necessário realizar o credenciamento na mesa localizada na área externa do auditório. O credenciamento encerrará às 10 horas. Auditório, levantai-vos.
Então,
Solicitamos aos presentes que retornem aos seus lugares. Solicitamos aos presentes que retornem aos seus lugares. Auditório, levantai-vos. auditório, sentai-vos.